Up until this point, everything that we've talked about has been using the utilities that are inside Dynamics 365 or leveraging utilities like Flow and Power Apps and stuff to extend functionality with very little or no code. But as we've talked about, as we've gone through this, at some point in time, you're going to need to leverage a developer. And so what we want to do in this module is just talk about, what are some of those key areas where a developer comes into play. So at least from a conversation standpoint, you can engage with your developers and have very strategic conversations about how you want to move this information moving forward. So in this module, we're just going to talk a little bit about, some of the different connection options and provide you with a little bit of an overview of the different web services that are available. Talk a little bit about where plugins come into play and some of the architecture capabilities around plugins. Talk a little bit about custom workflow activities, compare them a little bit to custom actions in regards to what their functionality can be. Talk a little bit about the web API and how the web API can be used to facilitate integrations with applications. Talk a little bit about web resources and how you could use web resources to create almost like a custom, inside the application user interface that could surface things like mapping functionality or could surface information from third-party applications to really provide kind of that dynamic way for your users to interact with the application. And then obviously look at client-side scripting. And if you don't have a mechanism in place using just kind of your regular business rules, how client-side scripting can be leveraged to really extend that functionality out above and beyond to the next level. When we started talking about, how do you extend Dynamics 365, really when you start writing custom code or custom developing situations, it really breaks down into three baseline areas. It's clients, the server level, and then integration with other applications. Now at a client level, it really gets around some of the navigation and commanding. Now we've talked a little bit with the App Designer and the Sitemap module that you don't necessarily have to go in and do a lot of custom coding around the application module anymore to be able to modify sitemap navigation. However, it's still beneficial from an XML standpoint if you want to provide some additional levels. There are some options that you just don't necessarily have when you start talking about using the Sitemap Designer and the App Designer. Obviously, client-side scripting is a huge aspect in regards to where you're going to write and extend functionality, because this is where, if we want to get into very specific targeted pre-population of data, this is where we have the ability to do that. This is where we get into the ability to do like input masking, which we really don't have the ability to do with business rules, and also get into more of your complex business logic around calculations and defining how we're going to calculate different items within the application. But it also constitutes the opportunity for us to go in and write custom user interfaces. So using things like web resources and using things where we can populate web resources with specific items, we can now really create dynamic elements inside the user interface that can be consumed by our users. Now at a server level, you really get into three baseline scenarios. You get into your plugins. So you have a plugin that is going to maybe interact with an external web service. Maybe you have a plugin that is going to provide some very complex logic based upon what people are doing inside the application. You also have your custom workflow activities where you can create a custom activity that can be added to any standard workflow or dialogue that can be executed by a user. Now, custom workflow activities and custom actions are somewhat similar in the fact that they both contain input and output parameters. The major difference is custom workflow activities are built by developers and then brought into the application to be consumed by end users, whereas custom actions are typically built by business users or end users inside the application and then have the ability to be consumed and worked with from a developer perspective. There's two baseline different ways that you can do that. A lot of people are starting to lean towards the custom action scenario just because with custom actions, I can execute a plugin based upon that custom action and I have a little bit more flexibility. Now, the other option that you start talking about is your integration. Maybe you have a custom third-party application that you want to be able to interact with. Maybe you have plugins that need to facilitate an integration with a third-party application. Using things like Azure, we can actually do remote plugin execution where we can execute plugins that interact with third-party applications that are hosted outside of our organization or hosted out in the cloud somewhere. I can use Power BI to really supplement the reporting functionality that's built into Dynamics 365 and build very powerful reports that can be consumed inside the application. And ultimately, we get into things like SharePoint, where I can do direct integration with a SharePoint, and now I can facilitate things like document library storage. I can facilitate things like using SharePoint search functionality to search Dynamics 365 information, any number of different items that might be at my disposal as I'm moving forward. So one of the first ways that a developer could extend functionality using code would be with plugins. Now, plugins are very much kind of similar from a real-time workflow perspective, but on a much larger scale. So these are actually .NET assemblies that are going to be developed using something like Visual Studio, but they're going to execute much like we talked about with the real-time workflows. They can execute at different stages. So when something is updated, if you update a record, I can trigger a plugin to fire off of a record being updated. And when that record is updated, much like we did with real-time workflows, I would have the capabilities to go in and have that plugin execute before the actual database operation or after the database operation. But the key with plugins is it gives me the capabilities to bring in much more complex business logic than I could with workflows. Workflows are still limited to what can be executed from within the context of the workflow editor. Plugin, you're really only limited by what your developer can think of. So if I have very complex evaluation patterns, if I want to pull information from an external service, all of that information can be done with a plugin assembly. And when I register the plugins, I have the ability to determine how I want that plugin to execute. Should it execute as a specific user so I can elevate permissions to execute plugins from there? I also have the capabilities to execute it as the calling user. And because I'm developing all of this information with .NET, I have the ability to do things on a much larger scale where I can write more complex queries on how I want to execute that information. I can execute transactions on a larger scale where I can execute them almost like batch transactions, so I can execute functionality on multiple records at a time. It just gives me a little bit more flexibility when I'm moving forward on those particular items. Now, the other thing that's nice about these is plugins work with both on-premise and online deployment, so it doesn't necessarily matter what type of deployment that you're working with. But the other thing that's nice is they do allow you to do offline capabilities. So from a plugin perspective, if I want to, I can execute that information offline and then while I'm using the Outlook client, and then have it kind of come back into the application. So I can determine whether or not I'm offline. There's a complete registration process that can be done with some of the developer toolkits. I even could deploy stuff up into my server directly through Visual Studio. So there's a lot of flexible options around plugins. It's just a matter of determining that's probably the next step. If you can't accommodate what you want to accommodate using things like real-time workflows, business rules, those types of situations, plugins would be the next logical step to move forward and start developing those custom assemblies to be brought into your application. The other option that you have is custom workflow activities. Now, we talked a lot about custom actions when we were working on the configuration versus code module. And custom workflow activities are very similar from a conceptual standpoint. The big difference is with custom workflow activities, you're basically kind of building the developer is developing black box functionality that can be consumed and worked with inside the application through workflows and dialogues. So they build a .NET assembly. Within that .NET assembly, they define the input parameters for the data they want to capture. They define the output parameters for what they want to push out. And then they define how to work with those particular situations. Then what they do is they register that just like they would register a plugin into the application. As soon as you register a custom workflow activity with Dynamics 365, it now shows up as an action. So if you think about when we were creating those workflows, we had those drop downs where we could execute actions. One of the actions you will see is these custom workflow activities. And just like we did within the custom action, you would, when you associate that you want to run this custom workflow activity, it will then ask you for the input and output parameters. And so the difference here is it's being built by a developer and then consumed by an end user. Again, depending upon the type of deployment, if it is an online environment or an on-premise environment, it works this exact same situation. It's just a matter of how you are going to build it and deploy it. Now, the other side to that is some people do like the custom actions a little bit more just because of the fact that I can build the custom actions as a user who understands the business process, and then I can use the custom action to raise an event that a developer can attach a plugin to. They both work in very similar concepts. They both give you about the same end result. It's just a matter of which one's going to work best in your particular environment, but concepts are the same. So if you remember, custom workflow activities are black box functionality built by developers, consumed by business users. Custom actions are black box or declarative functionality built by business users that can potentially be consumed by developers. And that's really the major difference. Another way that developers can interact with Dynamics 365 is using the Web API. So the Web API was just recently kind of reintroduced in previous versions and highly updated to reflect kind of the growing trends that are happening from a development standpoint. So it's currently now built off of OData version 4. And what's nice with the new Web API is you really have the ability to do most of the stuff that developers would traditionally do with what's called the SOAP API. And what's nice with the new Web API is it gives you the ability to work with different types of authentication scenarios where you can either work with Windows authentication or they can use it to use OAuth to authenticate to an instance to actually perform some types of actions. Now where you see this used quite a bit a lot of times is like with authentication to web resources, to be able to manipulate web resources and pull information in from third-party areas. But you have a lot of the same things that they can use with the Web API to do things like interact with the discovery service. They can query some of the new information and work with items from there. But it's much more using the OData methodology and using the REST endpoint to really work with Dynamics 365 implementations. The plugins and workflows that we would typically see use the SOAP endpoint or use the organization service, and that's still typically kind of what they're recommending. So for most calls, if you want to do things through web resources or was part of different situations, they're recommending using the Web API, which uses OData version 4. And now what's nice about this is there's different ways that you can handle navigating. So from an OData perspective, you can use this if you wanted to interact with a web resource. You could use this for navigating to different situations. You could use this for adding records to the application. So you can actually go in and query records using Git. You can actually patch records, you can update the records, you can delete records. These are all different options that are available basically when querying information through URL. So it gives you more of a unified way to organize the information inside the application. And now you have the capabilities to control how you want to navigate, how you want to filter, and how you want to handle multiple results when they're coming back. And so this is just another kind of more modernized way that developers can go out and interact with Dynamics 365 data on a way that's going to give them a lot of different options for interacting with some of the new modern web technologies that are out there. When you really want to provide a dynamic look and feel to your Dynamics 365 implementation, web resources are a great way to do that. Now, web resources are used in a variety of different capacities across the application. You're going to use web resources from an image perspective to do things like, update the images in your app module. You might use web resources to facilitate images inside your actual custom entities that you're creating within the application. You might even use web resources to upload a bunch of JavaScript libraries that you want to use to add client-side functionality to the application itself. But at the same point in time, you could also use some of these web resources to upload very specific functionality. So for example, maybe I want to do a service coverage for a specific type of service that we're looking at, or I want to look at an account that services a specific area. I could create a custom web resource that basically has a map interface that looks at kind of longitude and latitude of where this particular organization sits, and now defines a service area that is displayed as part of that map. So I could now see, if I am trying to schedule somebody to use this particular account, I could see if that information is associated with it. Now, what's nice about these web resources is there's a variety of different types. There's web pages, there's style sheets that can be used, there's JavaScript. Those are really the main consumable ones that you would be brought in. But when you bring these web resources in, all these web resources are now associated as components. So they're just like regular solution components built into the application. So therefore, if you are going to package them as part of a solution and then export them and import them into another environment, they travel very, very well. You can bring them into your another environment and kind of work with them from there. The other thing that's nice with these web resources is, depending upon what the web resource is, they can be added to Dynamics 365 forms, they can be added to different dashboards, they can just be used in different contexts of the application. So they provide a huge level of flexibility anytime you want to add just kind of that custom look and feel. And again, because they are being stored inside the solution, they're now available when you start talking about using Outlook with offline access. They're available to be accessed offline as well. So this is probably one of the bigger ones when you start to see people physically wanting to manipulate the user interface a little bit. Web resources are one of those items that really move to the next level. And it's one of the few items inside the application that really doesn't have an out-of-the-box equivalent. There isn't really an out-of-the-box built-in functionality that's going to give you that same level of options that you would see from a web resource perspective, because of the ability to do the dynamic stuff. But a lot of the functionality, like with the client-side scripting and some of those things, can be duplicated, but web resources are probably one of the major areas that really would have to be built and developed by a developer. The final one that would really look at it from a developer standpoint would be your API-driven scripting or your client-side scripting. Now, we've talked a lot about business rules and comparing those to client-side scripting. The big thing to remember with client-side scripting is it gives you just a little bit more oomph than what you might see from a business rule perspective. And so when we start talking about functionality and flexibility on forms, think of it more from a complex standpoint. I want to do more formatting. I want to format a phone number based upon different situations. There really isn't a mechanism with business rules to be able to format a specific phone number to a specific type of look and feel. Now, data validations I can do with business rules, but they're very simplistic data validations. I can compare a singular field based upon a different item, or I can compare it based upon a different value. Maybe I need to look at what's been entered into 5 or 6 different fields. That's where client-side scripting comes into play. Or maybe I have some very complex, maybe shipping calculations or items that I want to be able to dictate based upon those options. That's where client-side scripting comes into play. Now, the other thing is where you started to look at business rules from a perspective of, when a record is loaded or when something changes. From a client-side scripting standpoint, we can take it on a much larger scale. We can look at it when a record loads. We can obviously look at it when a field changes, but we can also start looking at it when a record's been saved, or when somebody, moves from one tab to another. Or we can even look at, as people enter and exit specific stages of business process flows, we can interact with that from a client-side scripting perspective. The other thing is, where business rules are much more on a field level, client-side scripting is much more on an entirety level. So I can hide entire sections. I can hide entire tabs using client-side scripting, where I couldn't necessarily do that with business rules. The other thing is, I can build script libraries. So I can upload all my client-side scripts as script libraries via the web resource functionality. And once I upload those, they're now available for me to attach to multiple forms. Now, I have to pick the forms that I want to associate them with. But the nice thing about that script library is, if I have one script that's associated with 5 different forms and I change that script, it's going to update that script on all the forms that script is associated with. So by using script libraries, it allows me to kind of make that change in in a centralized location and then work with information from there. Now again, it's really up to you in regards to which one's going to work. Probably the clearest area that I can kind of tell people from a client-side scripting versus a business rule situation is complexity. Complexity is going to drive the determination as to whether or not to use client-side script versus business rules. Business rules are simplistic. They run at a field level. You don't have to upload anything. You can have them be created by non-developers. But when you start getting into your traditional client-side scripting, now you're getting into JavaScript that has much more complex type tasks and gives you the ability to just do a little bit more as you're moving forward. But definitely would be the next step. If you can't accomplish it with business rules, client-side scripting is definitely where you want to go from there. Once it's time to engage a developer, there's a lot of options available to you. But what I usually tell people is, look at what's already there first. Look at the business rules. Look at the workflows, whether they're asynchronous or real-time, business process flows, custom actions, even third-party utilities like Microsoft Flow. All of those items can give you very similar context in regards to what you might want to try to accomplish from a developer perspective. Now, again, they all have limitations. They're not going to replace what you need to do from a developer standpoint. And that's why we wanted to, in this module, introduce the concepts that are available from a custom development standpoint. So again, at least you have kind of an understanding of what you would be asking for or what you might require when you start to engage in talks with developers. And so in this module, we really just wanted to provide an overview in regards to how you connect and work with the web services in Dynamics 365. What are the different types of custom development capabilities that are out there? We talked a little bit about plugins and what plugins are used for and how plugins are a little bit different than what you might see from a real-time workflow perspective inside the application. And we talked about how plugins can be used to and be registered with different stages or different parts of the database transaction to provide maximum flexibility. We talked a little bit about custom workflow activities and how that's kind of your black box functionality that's built by a developer and then consumed inside the application through either workflows or dialogues by business users, and how they are different in corresponding fundamentals from what you might see with custom actions. We talked about the web API and how the web API can be used to perform a variety of different actions, including creating records and updating records and using OData to really interact with things like web resources. And we talked about how web resources really allow you to create kind of that custom user interface and how web resources are used throughout the application, whether it's for image files for specific custom entities, whether it's JavaScripting for client-side scripting fundamentals, or whether it's using things like style sheets and HTML files to really build that custom dynamic interactive functionality inside the application. And then we finally talked about client-side scripting and how client scripting is kind of the next step from business rules, and how while business rules really focus on simplistic field level scenarios, client-side scripting focus on more complex scenarios built and more form-specific scenarios where I can work with entire tabs and entire sections. But a combination of all of this information is what's going to build together and allow you to at least start engaging those conversations with your developer about what your next steps are if you need to custom develop applications. So as you can see, there's a lot of options available to you when you start looking at how do you want to extend Dynamics functionality or Dynamics 365 functionality without actually having to engage a developer and bring it into the mix. A lot of the out-of-the-box functionality, things like calculated fields and roll-up fields, those have been implemented over the course of time to combat requests that people have had. We want to be able to facilitate this through the application user interface, and these are things that you don't necessarily always think of, and that's what we wanted to really focus on in this course is, you have the ability to highly tailor and customize and extend this functionality without always having to engage a developer just by using many of the different system tools that are associated with the application, and that's really what we wanted to focus on. So over the course of this particular course, we've talked a little bit about a variety of different things, but one of the first things we talked about is the new app designer. And the new app designer is great because now you have the ability to go in and really create your own modularized applications that can now be navigated to do through the navigation menu. So again, like if you've seen with the Dynamics 365 for sales, for service, field service, project service automation, if you have something that is very targeted based upon what you want to do, you can use the app designer to go in and basically create the container for that application. And inside that application, we can do things like control what specific dashboards we want to display when inside that item, what specific charts we want to use inside that application itself, and what entities should be displayed inside our custom app, and what specific forms and views and items related to those entities should be brought into there. If I have specific business process flows that I want to associate with that, I can also target those business process flows at my application. And once I create that application, there is a sitemap editor inside there that allows me to go in and actually modify how people are going to navigate through my custom app. And I can use that new sitemap editor to not only control my custom application, but I can also control how people will just navigate through the application as well. And I can do things like control how different components are displayed, and I can rename what you want to call some of these different apps, and I can even lock down my apps by security role to determine who should have what specific access to what apps inside my organization. We also looked at using CRM components versus coding. We talked about things like business rules and how business rules are a little different from a client-side scripting perspective, and we talked about what are the differences in how they're executed. We looked at using real-time workflows and how real-time workflows give you very similar functionality to what you would see from a plugin perspective, but at the same and still participate in the database transaction, but now allow you to work with them on a much more business user type situation. And we also showed you how you can use custom actions to create more declarative logic that's based upon functionality inside your application, and how those custom actions can be executed via a workflow, and then if need be, a developer could register plugins to talk to those custom actions moving forward. We looked at items like Flow and Power Apps and the Common Data Service, and we showed you how using Flow to connect to your Dynamics 365 instance now enhances your automation capabilities by going out and being able to initiate record creation from items that took place in other applications, or take some functionality that initiates in Dynamics 365 and now initiate other functionality outside of Dynamics 365. But we also talked about how by taking something that maybe originated in SharePoint, you can feed it into Dynamics 365, and then I would have the capabilities at that point in time to initiate a Dynamics 365 workflow that handles some type of process and then maybe hand it back to another application for custom approval. We talked about many of the different machine learning capabilities that are now in preview as part of Dynamics 365. We talked about using text analytics to do knowledge-based article recommendations, to do topic analysis, to go in and use it for document suggestions. We talked about how the recommendation service can be configured to actually go out and recommend different products based upon different products that have been purchased together in the past and different users who have purchased different items in the past. We talked about how you can take Dynamics 365 and link it with other applications to create records automatically. So we talked about the record creation rules and being able to utilize and surface some of those through social engagement. And with a combination of those different items, when we talk about flow and we talk about using custom actions and we talk about linking and using the record creation rules, you now really start to see that there really isn't very many situations where you can't facilitate creation of records inside Dynamics 365 from other applications anymore. There's really not a lot of restrictions around that where you would have to be a developer. There's a lot of non-developer options that you can use. And then finally, we talked a little bit about if you ever do need to engage a developer, what are some of the things that a developer can do? We talked a little bit about how they can utilize plugins, and we talked a little bit about custom workflow activities and how OData can be used to interact with some of your different web resources and where web resources can be used inside the application. And we talked a little bit more specifically about the differences between business rules and client-side scripting. So if you ever need to engage a developer to have those conversations, you at least understand what some of the different components are that you have moving forward. So that's going to do it for this course. Again, as always, I want to say thank you very much for watching. I hope you found it informative and helpful. And I just want to say thanks again for watching, everybody. Take care and have a good one.